Originating from Chico State University, welcome to The Real Issue. As we continue our discussion of the California drought, we focus now on the impact on North State farmers and agriculture. Agriculture, of course, is an important part of the culture and the economy here. And California supplies the rest of the nation with the vast majority of fruits, vegetables, and even tree nuts, such as almonds and walnuts. So the question for tonight's discussion includes how the current drought is impacting farmers and whether the farmers themselves and the state are prepared for the inevitable changes in our water supply. To talk about farming in the North Central Valley is retired lifelong farmer as well as aerial firefighter Bob Hennigan. Bob Hennigan has been working on issues around water protection for over 40 years. Thanks for being here tonight, Bob Hennigan.
My pleasure.
So, Bob, your family has farmed this area for a long time, just outside of Chico on Rock Creek. I want to ask you, first put it into historical context for us. How long has your family been in this area farming? And then if you could talk about some of the changes that you've seen in terms of the crops as well as changes in technology as the result of the accessibility to water.
My grandfather came to the property that you described from Durham in 1919. And we have a picture of my grandfather harvesting almonds in about 1915 in Durham. And you'll notice that how far apart the trees are. So the trees had to be far apart so that the roots could exploit a lot of soil to get enough moisture. Now, this is before irrigation. So, of course, later we could bring the trees much closer together because we were irrigating. And now the limiting factor is sunshine. We're at the limit of the sunshine now.
And so how far apart are the trees generally now? I mean, I drive down the road and I see an orchard and they're...
Almond trees are maybe 25 feet apart now.
Yeah, yeah.
Sometimes even a little less. Whereas, they would have been more than twice that far apart 100 years ago.
And so what are the changes in the crops from 100 years ago when your grandfather came here in 1919 into this area? What kind of changes in the crops themselves?
The biggest change in the crops here are that in those days they were annual crops. They were grains, small grains. A few other things were tried, but mostly small grains and some vegetables. Whereas now, the North Valley has largely converted to orchard. Almonds, walnuts, some fruit, but mostly almonds and walnuts.
And my understanding, the difference between an annual crop and a permanent crop, such as almonds and walnuts, is that you can't, if it's a dry season, you can't let them go. You have to continue to water them.
That's the big difference. That's the big difference from an operational point of view.
Yeah. So you're sort of stuck.
Yes.
Okay. So, Bob, when you talk about the changes in the irrigation system, we see more of a demand on the actual water here in the North Valley. And I'm not even talking about the drought itself. It's just a matter of over the last 100 years with the ability to tap into that water, to have irrigation systems. You've referred to what has happened over the last 100 years as dewatering of the valley. Talk about what that means and maybe some of the changes that you've seen in your lifetime here.
Well, in order to supply that water, we built a system of dams and canals to supply some of it. And a great deal of it in the North Valley is coming from the aquifers. And we have been dewatering in that the aquifers have been pulled down, and the lower Tuscan is the main aquifer here. There are 5 counties in this area that underlie the lower Tuscan. And as we have drawn down the water, the shallow water is disappearing from the shallow aquifers. You have two types of aquifers here. You have the shallow alluvial aquifer and the deep confined aquifer. The deep confined aquifer is mostly recharged from the edge of the valley, whereas the shallow alluvial aquifer mostly rainfall sinks in and recharges that. But we're drawing everything down, and that's disconnecting the small streams from the water table, and so the small streams have been gradually disappearing in the on the ranch. Old time perspective now. There was a large Indian village. Now that village was there for thousands of years, and as far as I can determine, they were not connected to Cal water. So those Indians were drinking water from the creek, and we fished in the creek. We had quite a lot of biological indicators. We had little freshwater mussels that disappeared in the 50s. And then by the 60s, we had to haul water for the livestock because the water would disappear for a long enough period that even there weren't even any holes for the animals to drink from. And so as we've drawn those aquifers down, we've been continually disconnecting the parts of the ecosystem.
And so what it sounds like is, in the original picture that we saw of your grandfather, and all those trees were very far apart, you were restricted in terms of agricultural production of rainfall, basically. Then we have this irrigation. Yeah, we have this technology advancement in the irrigation system. You can pack in the trees a whole lot tighter. You're depleting the water faster, the groundwater, because the trees with their tap roots, and we're seeing the reduction in the streams and the rivers.
Right.
So when we talk about the Delta smelt is having a very hard time, we don't even think about the mussels that went extinct back in the 50s. So it's so we're watching it. You have seen the disappearance of a lot of these indicator species that we only talk about these days.
That's the perspective that I have, because my family's been here for over 100 years.
Right. One of the things that you had mentioned to me, and I have a wonderful image in my mind about the pitchfork. Talk about how you would catch your dinner.
Well, when my grandparents first came to the property, a big part of their annual food budget came from their garden and from pitchforking salmon out and canning them. And it's probably been 40 years since there was a salmon in that stream.
Right. With a pitchfork, we've come a long way. Bob, I want to ask you, I want to take advantage of the fact that you are a very knowledgeable farmer. And I want to talk about some of the numbers so that we can get a sense of how much water is being used for agriculture in the state of California. We produce a lot of food in California, and so it's important to know how much water is being used where. If we talk to the California Department of Water Resources, they say that 80% of the water is used for agricultural purposes, 20% for urban uses. If we talk with the California Farm Bureau, they'll tell you, oh no, agriculture only uses 40% of the water. Bob, who's right, and why are people, these different groups, so insistent of using a different set of numbers?
Well, you'll have to ask them why they insist on doing it,
okay.
but they do. They're both right because they're both keeping score in a slightly different way. With the Department of Water Resources, they're counting the water that is somehow handled by the Department of Water Resources and their allied agencies. So that water was dammed and pumped and put in a canal or a pipe and moved somewhere and metered to a customer. So yes, agriculture uses 80% of that.
And so when you say customer, you're talking about either agriculture or urban uses.
Right. Somebody's paying for it.
Okay.
So agriculture uses 80% of that water.
Okay.
The Farm Bureau is right because the Farm Bureau counts all the water. And if you count all the water, there's a great deal of it that never gets into the DWR system. It just goes down a creek somewhere, sometimes directly into the ocean, sometimes into the river, and it flows out ultimately to the ocean or evaporation. But it doesn't get handled by the water purveyors. It's free and native and natural.
And so I wonder, I know you're going to tell me to go ask the California Department or Farm Bureau, but I wonder if the reason for saying it's only 40%, is it because what that suggests is there's a lot more out there that we could use or exploit in terms of farming?
Well, I'm probably speaking out of turn now, but I don't think it's unreasonable to count all the water. And there may be just a recognition that we're still reserving a lot of water for the environment. We're not exploiting all the water, every drop of water. We're leaving quite a bit of water in the system in an attempt to mitigate our impact.
Mm-hmm. And that's not unreasonable.
No.
It's not an unreasonable strategy.
No, I don't think so.
Bob, one of the, as a farmer, you're on the ground. And so you really, I have a lot of farmers that have said to me, farmers are the best environmentalists because you're on the ground and you have every incentive to protect the land. One of the realities of farming is that sometimes the rains don't come when you need them. And of course, then we need to store the water. And if we look at government agencies, they think of it as big projects, and we can think of it in terms of Shasta Dam, where there's lots and lots and lots of water to be used in the summer when the rains are gone. On the other hand, as a farmer, you're on the ground, and you see projects, small-scale projects that might assist in
yes.
access to water. Talk about some of the projects that you're seeing.
I was involved with our local reclamation flood control district. And we worked for a number of years on a flood meadows project. We had small tributaries, and we could build a series of flood meadows, kind of like rice fields, and would function kind of like rice fields do. It would reduce local flooding, but it would also hold back a significant amount of water. But the bureaucratic inertia and the bureaucratic resistance and the agencies that you have to get past to do anything like that made it simply unfeasible. And I had some neighbors who went through the same experience on the west side. They had a little stream that was just an annual flow of water for a few weeks, and they wanted to put in an earthen dam and hold back a few 100 acre feet. And they would keep some for environmental purposes. They would store some very short term for flood control, and then they would keep a little bit in the middle that they would use on their orchard. And they invested tens of thousands of dollars and years in trying to do this. But government agencies are oriented toward huge projects, and that's especially important to the politicians who vote for them, because they need a large expanse of concrete to fix their bronze plaque with their names on it. And it's important who gets credit.
Bob, go on.
My wife did the math. She was intrigued. She saw a connection beyond what I saw. And she said, well, gee, there are an awful lot of these little streams around the edge of the valley. And if you did all of those little streams with flood meadows, how much water would that be? And she was astounded to find that it was somewhere between 20 and 24% of the flow of the Sacramento River would be recaptured for not very much investment.
Well, now,
but there's no place to put the plaque.
Exactly. Well, the question that I have that I sort of struggle with as I listen to that idea is, does that contradict somebody with water rights? Somebody that says, hey, you have moved that water, you have set up a barrier, and you have blocked my water, because if that water flows, then I get part of that water. So in a sense, are you violating the historic water rights system?
Someone could make that argument, but I don't think it's a very good argument, because mostly we're talking about water that really is a nuisance, and sometimes a danger, because we have these events where 3 freak storms line up, 1, 2, 3, and pour staggering amounts of water on the ground, and it all rushes out through the Golden Gate in a muddy mass. And it's topped some levees and done some damage, and done very little good for anyone.
But it seems that there's no real mechanism in the state government to deal with the kinds of small-scale projects that you're working on, and it seems like that might be an opportunity to really take advantage of water that is a nuisance, as you put it. Yeah, so maybe there's that.
Well, let's be hopeful.
Okay. All right. Well, let's move on. Let's keep talking about possible solutions. And I don't know if this is a solution. I know that it's a practice that has been going on, and that is, I think a lot of folks refer to it as groundwater transfers, and it is that. Or groundwater substitution, I'm sorry. And it's that time when if you have water rights to the surface water. And what folks do is they sell the water. If I have water rights, then I might sell my surface water down to the south, and then I substitute the water that I need by pumping groundwater. And so I want to ask you, as a farmer from the farming community, I want to know how widespread that practice is of selling your water to the south and pumping that substitution. And do you think that that's a good long-term solution? Well,
the bookkeeping is a little suspect, so we don't know exactly how much of that is occurring. The problem is that we are doing this in slow motion. We're doing in the Sacramento Valley what they did in the San Joaquin Valley, and we're doing it in slow motion. The recovery is slow, and we don't know a lot of the courses of recharge. We don't know the mechanisms and the rates of recharge around the edges, but we know that we're getting behind. Now, some people call this double dipping,
right,
because a farmer will sell the water that he would have used to plant his crop, and then pump groundwater. Those of us who are on the edges of the valley and don't have ditch water are pretty concerned about that.
I imagine that you're pretty concerned about it, because if I have a parcel of land and I'm pumping groundwater, I could argue that it's my land and therefore it's my water, but the pool underneath my land is connected to the pool underneath your land. And so what is astounding to me, what I learned pretty recently, is that up until very recently, California has never regulated groundwater.
That's correct.
And so I want to ask you about this recent act that has come into effect, and it's called the Sustainability Groundwater Management Act. And it's a way that different places across the state will identify a local entity to start regulating groundwater. And then the idea is to start coordinating those efforts statewide. So Bob, talk about how effective you think this plan might be.
Well, I'm so glad that the state legislature made an effort, and we'll give them credit for seizing a thorny issue. But there are a couple of weak points in what they've done. They started with Bulletin 118 from the Department of Water Resources, and this is a bulletin that describes shallow alluvial aquifers, not deep water aquifers, not deep confined aquifers. So you've already omitted the most important, because all of our municipal, industrial, and agricultural water comes from the deep confined aquifers, not from the shallow alluvial aquifers.
And when you say the deep confined aquifer, you're talking about, for example, the Tuscan.
For example, the Tuscan.
Okay.
And the Tuscan underlies 5 counties. So who's going to manage the lower Tuscan aquifer?
It doesn't sound like you support this effort. For one thing, I know that it doesn't come into it's not fully implemented until 2047, I think. And so I wonder if it's effective at all. But I'm wondering, are farmers, I know that environmentalists are a little upset about what is going on in terms of the de-watering of the valley, but I'm also wondering, as a farmer in the farm community, are other folks upset about this lack of management of our groundwater?
Farmers mostly look inward. They're not the kind of people who want to regulate what their neighbor's doing. They want to be left alone. You got several things in your question there that should be addressed. First, the state legislature did wake up enough to realize that there was a problem, and they made an effort. What I hope is that they come back and revisit it and try to start addressing some of the things that they left out. A couple of things to think about. 25 years ago, the Sacramento River became a losing river at Grimes, just below the Sutter Buttes. And that is, a losing river is one where water is flowing out into the ground faster than it's flowing in from the tributaries. Today, 25 years later, that transition takes place at Red Bluff.
So we are watching the dissipation of the water move further and further up the river.
Right. So we don't have till 2047. Right. You have to remember what happened in the San Joaquin Valley and how fast it happened. In the 1850s, they were burning seagoing ships at Stockton because there were so many abandoned ships. The gold rush had brought so many ships, and their crews would abandon them, that the river was choked with sailing ships, and the people of Stockton set them on fire.
And how quickly did the San Joaquin simply dry up?
Well, the last steamboat to Fresno was in 1911.
So we could really see the complete drying up of the Sacramento River to any, all intents and purposes in our lifetime.
But remember that when my father was a young man, he could jump across the Sacramento River in the summertime.
Okay.
So we've changed the Sacramento River dramatically. Will it dry up? Probably not. But the valley is still undergoing fairly rapid change. When you go 70 miles upriver in 25 years, that's a pretty dramatic change. And think about the wells on our property. When my father was a boy, we were irrigating with water we were pumping from 20 feet. Then after the war, we had to put in deep well turbines. The first of those deep well turbines to break suction was in 1973, just before the 76-77 drought. Some of those wells have had the bowls lowered 2 or 3 times as we've chased the water down.
How deep is your well today?
The deepest well is 755 feet.
20 feet to 700, over 700 feet.
Yeah.
Bob, I need to, in the last couple of minutes that we have, you're not a farmer anymore.
No.
Lifetime farmer, you're many generations of farming, and you're not a farmer anymore. Is it because you got bored with the lifestyle, or does it have anything to do with the access to water?
It has to do with the knot in my stomach and waking up in the night worrying about this, because I can see it happening. And I was a business major in college, and I kept looking at the numbers, and this was the best time since 1918 to trade agricultural property for commercial property. Best ratio since 1918. And I thought about knot in my stomach, no knot.
What's that land going to be used for now?
Oh, it'll continue in agriculture for a while.
Yeah.
But if we don't get serious, it'll only be for a while. And I think that would be a tragedy for everyone in California, and diminish the whole country.
And so, really, in just the last few seconds, you're not that confident about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. What is the solution, in your opinion? I know it is a very complicated issue. What's the solution in the last 30 seconds that we have together?
It can only be crafted by the legislature. They're the only one who has the power to do it. They made an effort, and it's a start. But they need to go back and make another serious effort at expanding and strengthening and streamlining, and they need to address the issue, and God grant that they can do that within the limits of being politicians.
So hope is not lost, it's just the first step. Thanks so much for being here today, Bob Hennigan. I appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in to The Real Issue. Join us next time as we continue our discussion about the California drought.